So, Chapter 8, the autochthonous order properties of formatted cues, just trills off the tongue. You might have a tongue cramp somewhere in the middle of autochthonous. It's easier for Latin-speaking people than for Germanic English-speaking people, because autochtono is a very common word in Italian and Spanish, and not in English. Your students will almost file a protest. But it's to be contrasted with the social construction of reality. It's like the opposite. We're not constructing, it's like these things happen by themselves, and we find them kind of opportunistically. And we help them along. We pick and choose and organize, but it's not like running, railroad cars. He says that these in the first sentence of the second paragraph on page 245, he says that autochthonous order properties are empirically observable properties of the congregational work of producing social facts. Okay? And further down that paragraph, they are observable in obvious places. They are observable by one and all. And by one and all they are witnessed and witnessable, depended upon, and demanded even, while they are seen but unnoticed. That's absolutely brilliant. That is, people, the observation, that you can even make an observation that people will demand this congregational work, that this work be done in the way that we're doing it, while being seen but unnoticed. And yet they are seen, but they may not know what they're doing precisely. They inhabit the enterprises of the streets as well as the privacy of bedtime talk. They're available in service lines, entering a freeway traffic stream, street crossings by pedestrian crowds, and walking together. And these are all topics that he actually did some research on, mostly as classroom projects. On the next page, in the very middle, he emphasizes in a very short paragraph, nothing needs to be introduced into the production and accountability of social facts. That is, he's saying don't theorize, don't reduce it to your best way of explaining it, rather just describe the way the people themselves are teaching each other what the order is. And it's for sure the discipline of sociology, at least, will chew you up over this one. That is, if you don't describe it, if you don't generalize it, it's not considered science. If you just describe exactly what people are doing, you'll get comments like, well, we're not supposed to be publishing journalism even if it's good journalism, right? So, people, and particularly when people have vested interest in particular theories, they will really become upset about your refusing to participate in the way that sociology constructs its local orderliness. They'll scold you just as much as those people in the London bus lines will scold you if you don't participate in their lines. Anyway, all we need to do is to describe what's going on, and as opposed to explaining, which usually involves introducing things that are external to what's going on. So what's so important about the autochthonous properties of order? They're the main tools that we use, but they're not deliberately designed. That is, they appear by themselves. They're highly social, intersubjective from the outset, and you can't count them. Or if you counted them, as we'll see in the next chapter, you won't have your focus on what the work really consists of. You will have already reduced that intersubjective work to something else altogether. If you look on 246, continuing from where we left off, service lines will serve our argument as its propedeutic focus and empirical case in point. Nothing needs to be introduced because parties to the apparent service line produce, as the existence of an exhibited order of services, autochthonous properties of order, not merely what is orderly about a service line, but just in any actual case, just and only in any actual case, what is orderly about a service line. So you don't have to add anything, you just have to find what they're doing. The collaborative work that people are doing is already highly social. It's already there. You just you just need to identify it. On 247, opposite the page at the top, line 4, each thing is locally produced and naturally accountable in displayed distinctive interaffiliations of details, endogenously interior to, and thereby exhibiting of their coherence. There's two very important terms here. The first is exhibiting. That's how people instruct each other. That's the local tutorials that people are engaging in teaching each other how do we get an order of service in this particular location. So they exhibit the order. The nice thing about cues is that there's not a lot of talk involved. There's a bit of talk. Similarly, the surfing studies I'm doing, I like it because there's not a lot of talk. That the key work is exhibitions and bodily movements, but there are plenty coherences. That is, there are enacted coherences, coherences that people produce and that they capture. So we're interested in studying where do these achieve coherences, when and how do they achieve, and when and how do they appear. And, you know, you don't need to count them, you need to see how they're done. Because the reason you don't want to count them is that they're not isolates, and only things that are individuals and isolated from other things can be counted. Rather, it's how they work together, how they operate in a system. It's kind of like a quantum effect that is a way of describing what Durkheim was getting at in the elementary forms of religious life. And they're only comprehended adequately when you capture them as they're being used by people in a live setting. And for a number of his chapters and his lectures, he gives us the name the shop floor practices. And he talks about that on 248 at the bottom, under the section Tutorial Problems at the Worksite. The shop floor, a natural metaphor, that's the last line on 248, is indispensable in that search. The metaphor is indispensable because it is ubiquitously used in the most diverse jobs and work settings by bench practitioners to make congregationally recognized, that's the exhibited, accountable provision for work's particular hexaides in and as of work's particular places and particular bodies, with just these instruments and with just this equipment in just this territory. So the hexaid refers to the just thisness of things, and by reducing them to the lowest common denominator so that they can be counted alongside other things, you lose that just thisness. So the shop floor practice is the social system at work that is more than the sum of its practices. The point then is to put into your hands a way, not a way of talking, not a literature, but a research experience, a way of engaging the real world so that you can discover its properties. Or what he calls on 250, in the first line, the work in and as of its details. That's the objective. That's the target. To say that we're studying local practices in a local setting is to imply in its grammar that the setting itself exists apart by itself on its own without those practices. So you're not studying practices in a setting, the practices are the setting. And we need to be very careful about how the way our grammar phrases our inquiries can distort our sight. The rules in a game are not just rules in the game, the rules are the game. So Garfinkel speaks of practices as the setting. Whatever we do, however we approach the research setting, however we talk about it, we want to land in the midst of things. And the methods we use must keep us in the midst of things. So you want to look at how what methods you're using to start out with, and then how you're analyzing the data that you get via those methods to see if that's keeping you in the midst of things, that is, the looks of the world for the parties that you're studying. It's really easy to not do that. And that's why I think sociology has been relatively unsuccessful compared to other disciplines, because it's lost the phenomenon time and time again. I'm now doing this really interesting project on surfing, which is more fun than work. Although it's hard to get it done because if the waves are really good, I put the camera down and go out. But the fascinating part of it is that it's teaching me a lot about what rules are. I mean, there's no officials, there's no application of formal rules, there's no ticketing. Very few court cases I've heard of. And there are some kind of rules, but they're not anything like the rules that I thought they were. The way sociologists think of rules, the sort of common sense, naive, well, we have the rules and then we act. Nothing happens like that. So I've gotten carried away on looking at rule-governed behavior, and I'm at the verge of losing the phenomenon. What are the surfers actually doing? I'm more interested in rules than they are. It's not that rules aren't a part of it, but I want to be very careful not to just turn my data into a dissertation on rules, because that's what the sociology establishment will buy from me. And that's how I'll get the next article published or whatever. That is, you want to keep re-examining your methods to make sure that they're keeping you not just in the midst of things, but in the looks of the world, in the horizon of meaning that the parties themselves are using. And if you're careful enough, you can catch it when you go too far with these reductions. I'm not giving up on rules, but I'm warning myself and warning my colleagues, let's be careful here. Of course, we can always go back to the videotape. So if the methods that you use take you away from the local work of people, you're doing something wrong. And so what's lost by quantifiable methods? Garfinkel tells us here the hexaides, the just what of the things. If you look on page 250 in the middle paragraph. From all this, we have a first observation of tutorial problems. They are this worldly settings wherein order productive parties, that is, members, so collaborate as to exhibit just what a social fact is that make it accountably just that. The exhibited order of service in supermarkets, the concerted freeway flowing together, safely inflating a repaired truck tire, talking hearable secrets in public to members of a secret society who have vowed to kill you if they hear you are talking irresponsibly, and so forth. Each of these, each thing, each object, each social fact, in its unmistakable, accountable orderliness that makes it just this social fact. Over the ground of its ongoing production, it is just this social fact that the order-producing staff is making, and they are doing it in such a way as to make it accountably this thing just this thing evidently. That is, they're oriented to the availability of those accounts for witness by the members, by the congregational fellows, so that it's evident to everybody. So the key here, the key words here are the accountably and the evidently. That's where our analysis is focusing. On page 251, on the second paragraph that says question, colon, what is the work that the local order production cohort is doing? And doing is in quotes because they don't know they're doing it, and it's not a deliberative decision science kind of thing. It's more of an opportunistic, accidental, serendipitous grabbing of autochthonously appearing possible ways of ordering the phenomenon. So the doing is in quotes. That makes, let me start the sentence. What is the work that the local order production cohort is doing that makes the produced social fact accountably just that? So you want to see how they coordinate, how the coherencies are almost pounced on and preserved and maintained. And the bottom short one-sentence paragraph in the middle of 251, ethnomethodology's standing task is to examine social facts, just in every and actual case, asking for each thing, what makes it accountably just what that social fact is. So the accountability is key. We're after witnessable orderlinesses, right? That is, the work of accounting is making things witnessable, making orderlinesses witnessable. Since parties need to make their procedures, their understandings, and their produced social facts witnessable for each other, they display them. And while people are engaged in these exhibitions for each other, we sociologists have a grand opportunity to find out just what it is they're doing. Because it's all public stuff. We can capture it. You know, whether we're just taking notes or trying to remember it later, as I'm going to have to do in El Salvador because they banned me from asking any questions, which I don't do anyway, but it also banned me from filming. Yeah. It's a really big thing, and they're playing it safe. It's a lot of money's involved in this. They don't want any. They're being kind to let me even come. But I can still look, right? And I can see what they're doing, what the coffee tasters are doing, because in each first time through, and I can tell you, each cupping is a first time through, they vary from one to the other. But they have to make it available because all the cuppers have to taste in the same way in order to come to an objective result. So anyway, while they're engaged in their exhibitions for each other, I and we can see what they're doing and describe it. That's why it's not impossible to do ethnomethodology, because we're only capturing what people are doing anyway. It's in the way in which the observability is present and available to the practitioners, and only in that way that it is available to the analyst. Okay, on to the Q and its practices. This is a good illustration for a number of things. It's a good illustration of accounts, of the exhibited orders. It's also a really splendid illustration of how ethnomethodology is not interested in subjectivity. There's no subjective analysis here. We're interested in quite the opposite, in the objective forms being produced, the objective and Durkheimian sense of social facts. So a cursory reading of ethnomethodology will miss this. Because we don't accept the Q in itself, you know, we're questioning it. Some people think we're subjectivists, but we're not. You can read the Q as a metaphor for anything else, and a metaphor for society, for as far as that goes. If you look on the bottom of 250, footnote 7, there's some thanks to Lucy Suchman for the ever-renewed analytic probity of this description on each next occasion that the produced plain appearances of cues are concerns of cueing's practices. So we're talking about produced plain appearances. Another reason why you might get criticized, or you might have people drop your course, is I'm not interested in plain experiences, plain appearances. I'm not interested in this mundane stuff. I want only important things, you know. But there are plenty of unimportant things in the world, so somebody ought to pay attention to them. There is a cue in itself, but that cue in itself only exists in the imagination of the people who are coordinating the cue. That is, there's not really a cue in itself, but the idea of a cue in itself is certainly there in people's minds. So that needs to be attended to. They invoke this social fact cue as if it exists apart. I mean, the way you get scolded, the way I get scolded at least, you know, makes you wonder, how did I miss it? You know? And people will think of this cue in itself as something that preceded the actual practices, the actual situated practices that produced it. And that's where we have this wonderful notion of Merleau-Ponty, of retrospective illusion, where we have the illusion that it was there all along, even though we just thought it up. And it's another example of an important idea that Garfinkel gets from Merleau-Ponty that he makes a lot of. I mean, it's amazing how you know, I guess I was badly scolded when I went to London about my the way I stand in lines. You know, I mean, I wasn't butting in at any point, but I just didn't do it in a way that was met with the approval of the people standing in line. And then I'm thinking about this in India. I know Yos has been in India, but I mean, India, they have queues. You know, they don't look like queues. It's a mass of people, and you know, the order of service, I still haven't figured out. I've lived there 6 years. I don't know. It's tough. Try to get something photocopied at a Xerox place, and you can be the first person in the line of sight of the server and still have 20 people be served before you. Because there's so much work for him to do, he doesn't want to take the time that it's going to take when he can do 10 others in the time it takes to communicate with you, I think is what it is. In any case, it's what I call the crush. I mean, it's just an absolute crush that nobody can argue with. It's sort of like people have power. And I see that on my video data in crossing Kincaid in Eugene, which is the second busiest crossing in the West Coast. You have, at a certain time of the day, there's so many pedestrians crossing that they run the show. And there's a critical mass of this crush. And it's a different phenomenon. Yet it's a very skilled practice. It's not disorganized. People say it's disorganized. My Japanese colleague who arrived on the scene says he'll never cross at that corner because it's very disorganized. I said, no, it's very organized. You just don't know what that organizing is. It's really fabulous. When I was in the Dubai airport, I had the opportunity to see these workers heading for usually for Doha and other Middle Eastern capitals, to do the grunt labor, mostly Muslims from India, but also some Hindus and Christians, but all of them do the crushing, regardless of religious affiliation. And the people in the Dubai airport were completely unprepared to deal with it. And you get this deal, if you fly on United Arab Emirates, which is great airlines, they give you, and if you change planes in Dubai, you get a free meal, whatever time of day it is, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It's great. You know, you just show your boarding pass. And so, of course, all the Indians traveling are keen on that. But, of course, they have so many people traveling, and it's a fairly large-sized cafeteria, but there's not a seat to be had. And so they monitor the line and let people come in one at a time, turn by turn. And the Indians don't know about turn by turn. They're doing the crush, and the whole gates are about to explode, and the United Arab Emirates staff are in tears. Stop, stop, and they're saying, why do they do this? Why do they do this? And then, but it was very effective. I mean, they got in. It was undeniable. When they arrived in Doha, they tried the same thing, but the border guards were not going to tolerate it. They got very firm, put their hand on their rifle, and all of a sudden, these people transformed into the most knowledgeable individual turn. I just thought that was the greatest thing, which shows you that it's not some deficiency in the character of the Indian mind, but it's a competent system for queuing in India that you have to learn, or you will never get a turn, right? And which one is best? Well, everyone thinks they're the best, right? Each one is best. But they're different systems. You take your own for granted, right? That's part of the retrospective illusion. But they all consist of details, and these are the cues details, which is what we're studying here. And in this chapter, Garfinkel describes these details as the places in line, practices for holding places, alignment, opening gaps to permit passage through the line while preserving the line's integrity, right? I mean, preserving the line's integrity is the work of people to produce an orderliness. And yet you have to create gaps, but you have to do the gaps in such a way that people can pass from one side of the store to the other without losing the competency of the line. I mean, that involves certain skill. Explanatory counts, like I'm with her, I'm not a person butting in, even if you are. Or my favorite, is this the end of the line, right? That can be uttered by an honest person looking for the end of the line, wanting to comply but not being able to find the end of the line. Or it could be uttered as an accusation against somebody who's not actively participating in the straight diligence of the line, as kind of like casually looking at a magazine or something, as like a criticism. Or it could be uttered by a person who was actually trying to butt in and was called out on it, and says, "Oh, where's the end of the line?" As though he's compliant all along, right? So there's all this place work. That's very fine-grained stuff, and Garfinkel and his students went out to capture that, mostly with cameras. I mean, still cameras. 256, in the middle of the page, there's a list of these things. And these things are in, sometimes he puts things in brackets, sometimes he puts stars, asterisks by things. These are names that he develops for practices, but he doesn't want to lose contact with the practice like he was recommending. He wants to be informed by what people are actually doing and come up with a name later, like the Moorsian glosses or the problem I'm having with the surfers. I don't want my glosses to be taking any priority over what they're doing. So here they are, the glosses. There exists a head of the line. There is an end to the line. Persons are so positioned as to make a great positioning to do about places in line. I mean, I love that. A great positioning to do. You know what that one is. That's the guy stretching, to reach the gum in the counter on the next line without losing his place, right? That is taking places, marking, holding, counting, and aligning places. In that, places in line are procedurally and ongoingly arranged and available as a phenomenal line. A newcomer is seen to openly examine the line of places, occasionally bypassing alongside the line from the front of the line toward places at the end of the line. So these are all kinds of phenomena which are reminiscent of his first catalog of practices in the lecturing of chemistry that we covered last week. It's an apparent line. It's not a real line. or it is a line. It's a line in the only sense that lines are lines, but it's apparent because it is apparent, and it's not necessarily certain. It's a problem because every line is different. I mean, some lines you take a number. You should see what goes on. Oh, do have this wonderful pleasure of having an hour to kill at the airport. Choose to spend it outside the line of the train tickets. You get all these new arrivals from every country in the world trying to get a train ticket, and not a combination of not really being able to figure out how the line is structured, which is you go and take a number from the machine, but it's the first time they're in Europe, a lot of them, and a lot of them are let's say, instead of butting in, let's just say very optimistic about their chances of walking up to these open windows that seem free of any crush that they would recognize. Because the crush is like 10 yards away. And so all day long these people are coming up to the window trying to push their way in, and then they're pretending not to understand whatever language it is they're using, right? And then and it's a routine. It's like the person is like they're very kind people who work at these windows, and they're kind of curious in people as well. And they try to indicate that they need to go get the number, but then the people play dumb, that they don't understand anything. And what number? What do you mean number? I don't see any number, right? And it's really funny. I mean, and this goes on time and time again. How they don't lose their patience, I have no idea. But anyway, the point is there's very detailed work that people are doing, and that's the level of details to which our studies of lines has to appear. I don't know. A lot of lines I would not call the apparent line as Harold does. I would call it the transparent line, since you can look right through it and not see it. And let me give you an illustration. I was in Lecce. I was invited by an ethnomethodologist who's fabulous, who passed away at a very young age. She'll be having an article in this edited volume on ethnomethodology in the courtroom that Oxford University Press is coming out with later this year, edited by Baudouin Dupré and Michael Lynch. And she invited me down there to give some lectures, and then I got into, there's good surf down there because the Lecce is down at the heel of the boots, so I made good connections, and so I signed up for an Italian class, and my Italian was not so good, but I love the food there, and I had to go get some Italian bread, which I'm always happy to do. And I went down to the local store, and it's all set up. You know, you just don't go in and get what you want and then check it out on a scanner. You ask the person, they get it. Your hands never touch anything until you're already requested it, right? And they have, what I didn't know is when you walk in, there's a bunch of people. There's 3 separate lines, only it's completely unapparent that there's 3 separate lines. There's a line for people buying meat, a line for people buying cheese and bread, and a line for people buying other groceries. And I know what to do when I get to a new kind of line. I just sit there and do nothing. I make eye contact so they know I'm waiting, but then I just watch and see what the orderliness is. And it's kind of interesting. I don't get bored. And I waited in that grocery store long enough for everybody who was there to be served and go, and for them to be replaced by an equal number of people who all came after I did. So then I felt it was safe to proceed, but I didn't figure out exactly that there were 3 separate lines. So I went close to, well, the person who seemed to be most available. That was the meat guy. And I couldn't speak Italian. And he said, I said, could I have a loaf of fresh bread? And he was very annoyed. He said, no, over there. I said, yeah, that bread. No, 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 no. And so I went to the other one, and then all of a sudden, everybody's complaining. You just can't butt in front, right? I mean, I don't know what they were saying in Italian. I know now, but then but I know that they were complaining that I was butting in. But I was there long before any of them. But I didn't do it in a competent way, right? So it was a tough situation. I mean, you try when you're in a line. You look for coherencies, and sometimes they're so transparent that they're just not available to you. If someone were to come in and say, "Will you please hold my place?" I wouldn't be able to do it. I mean, I don't know in that case what they were talking about. I don't know what a place consists of in that Italian grocery store, and it required a whole month of being there and going there at less busy hours to figure out just how that place was organized. And once I figured out how it was organized, I became one of the regulars. But I really felt unwanted, right? Lecce is not a place a lot of tourists go to, which is why it's really interesting. It's where you can learn Italian because they're not speaking English, which is why I went, in addition to the surf. On 354, line 7, just after 5, the order of service exhibits its character as a transcendental order of service. Transcendental meaning it's out there, it's not what I'm doing. The exhibited coherence, that is, it comes to cohere. Is he still able to participate?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. The exhibited coherence of the order of services properties permits the deep examination of their transcendentality. That is, you can study it because they consist of practices. But it's sometimes, it's an obvious fact to people in the line. It's not obvious to people who don't know the practices that produce that line. So for me, it wasn't the apparent line anymore. It was the unapparent line. So remember that typology that I put up a couple of times here. What is this work of coordinating? And I'm going to make more of this in the talk I give this summer at the conference. You have accounts. We're talking about accountable activity. And accounts need to be confirmed. And then they get to be what Garfinkel is called, following Schutz, who follows Husserl, there gets to be an objectivation, that it becomes this transcendental line. It becomes a social fact that exists and that everybody must comply with. And then there's another stage, which we're going to talk about now, and I draw this because we are going to talk about it now, which, this is my term, I call social amnesia. It's a bit like the retrospective illusion. That is, the social amnesia part is that we forget that we did all this. Okay, it's sort of a disengagement from the local practices, even though we're engaged in them all the time. If you'll look on page 254, and again, like our glosses, let's not ever divorce the model from any specific data to which it should be applied. Things don't happen because there's a model, right? Things happen and then there's a model to help understand it. Okay, then you throw the model away. Okay, on 254, the paragraph right after 6. The apparent line has another detail of its examinable production, the standing property that it is immortal. Right? This is Durkheim's notion. And it's somewhat touching that the footnote here, Garfinkel thanks his colleague when he was a graduate student who first came up with the idea, right? The line's immortality, continuing, possesses another and a distinct collection of the apparent line's empirical observables. Immortal means that at the work site, empirically observable, directly and immediately, there is this about the order of service. It is assured by reason of the turnover of its personnel, who themselves arrange for the turnover in the place where the service is being delivered. We observe that the immortality of the order of service has nothing whatsoever to do with lexical rhapsodies, such as some theorized version of an ideal cue. Quote, given once and for all, it can last forever. So the immortality is part of the practice. There's something about the making things orderly that requires this final stage of social amnesia. Hegel comments, and I get this is a citation from Adorno in Negative Dialectics. Hegel comments, it is downright essential that although the Constitution originated in time, it not be viewed as a product. That is, that we not see what we're doing to produce it. For it is that rather which is flatly in and for itself, and is therefore to be considered divine and enduring, and above the sphere of that which is produced. That is, the real important thing is that people take it as gospel, that it's morality. And so that's why I got into so much trouble in the Italian store. That's why I was so uncomfortable. Not because I couldn't get the bread, not because I felt uneasy in the confusion, but because people were morally outraged at my effort, this American, to butt in front, even though I was in the place before any other person at that time was in the place. If you look on 256, in that paragraph toward the bottom with a bit of italics, all these phenomenal field properties are the achieved coherences that you find of where is the line, have an additional enacted coherence that is affiliated with the coherence that is enactedly exhibited as the order of service. Their coherence is witnessably moral, right? What are you doing, Its morality recapitulates the property mentioned previously of indefinitely deep availability to the inexhaustible exploration once the analyst catches on to just this collaboratively exhibited existence of an order of service. Okay, this is so fascinating, this moral part, and that's adds insult to injury. I mean, it's bad enough to be incompetent. It's worse to be immoral. So that's what you're dealing with. And that's why people frequently want to do the right thing. They just don't know what that is, right? So when they speak of formatted cues, by formatted is meant that persons, in the way they position themselves, exhibit the existence of this order of service. And it exists for them as something apart from them, something independent. So somebody who can't see that is outrageous, even though it's sometimes impossible. That happens a lot in surfing. You get new surfers going out, and they get in the way because they can't see the turns. And then the veteran surfers basically say, "Get out. Your place to surf is over there. You see where all those little waves that are really shitty are? You work it out there, not here where it's really dangerous. You're in the way, and you're going to hit somebody." And yet, the novice surfer says, "They're really unfriendly. I don't like that place. I'm not going back." I mean, you get a lot of complaints because there's a lot of territoriality in surfing. But if you don't know the order of turn taking in the waves, there's a lot at stake. Those fins are very sharp and they cut heads open, and I had a friend who almost died of his thigh being cut. I just got into the hospital in time, right? So it's, if you can't see it, it takes a while. There's a learning process. But you do see it, and just how these coherencies appear, that's part of our inquiry. And that's why what you're doing in your research on the people moving the, what do you call them?
Forklift.
Forklifts, yeah.
Gym machine.
They're like these pallets. That's why it's so great, because I'm sure the learning, I think it's also good that you're studying the learning process, because you want to pay close attention to how these coherences are firming up or clearing, like cleaning, like when Gerda Hoppe was talking about how they clean up the star map, right? I mean, they get rid of all the noise, and this becomes clearer and clearer what they're supposed to see. And there's something like that going on. But since it's not talked about, it's going to be really hard. But anyway. So, you know, it's going to be, because they say some things, but they don't say enough. Surfers don't say enough to really do the work. People in the line don't say enough. They might say we're together, but mostly they don't say anything. It's all in their place work. It's what they do with their bodies. But then again, be careful. Anytime you come with a word like place work, there's the danger of giving a career to words like that. You know, you'll have a few words that really seem to capture the truth of it, and then all of a sudden they're pulling you by the nose, right? So you want to use the words, but you don't want to lose the phenomenon, which is the looks of the world given the horizon of understanding of the people who you're studying, okay? And I urge you, at the point of the last of this series of lectures, to have a look at the chapter on Garfinkel's uncompromising intellectual rigor, which I think is chapter 4 of the book Husserl's Criticism of Reason, that I gave a copy to Jos about 2 years ago. So you should have it. It's a really fun read, and it really, I think, emphasizes this point. And of all the things I've done, is I think what Harold was happiest with. Okay. So the formatted cue is examined and used to find a directional character. A head of the line and an end of the line being the first order of business. Using the head and the end, you locate a next place that you can occupy. So by joining the line in conformity with that situationally constructed next, you then not only find your place in line, but you contribute to the exhibition of that order of service. And if somebody new comes in, you can say to them, oh, you know, you have to sit over there until there's room enough for you to get in line. Or you have to take a number. That is, they coach each other. So I'm not just taking my place, I'm displaying and contributing by displaying the order of service, or the structures at least that I've located as the order of service. And what I offer then to the new people that come are naturally occurring accounts. They might vary slightly over the course of the day, but probably 3 years later, if you go back to the same store, I'll bet it'll be pretty much the same. That is given the name in Harold's work of local cohort independence. Okay? That's why we're not interested in subjectivity. So I provide these natural accounts first to be sure I'm right, to win or lose confirmation. And you get then what I call the look. That's your look after you give an account. And then you look is this right? Is this wrong? Am I going to get in trouble? You know, what are people going to say? You know, it's great stuff. And I go through my students' films, and whatever they're doing, whether it's games with rules or crossing or whatever, coffee tasting, I clip out these looks, and then I show them in slides to the students. This look you know well. It means they just said something, they said it with great confidence, but they're not confident in the slides. And look how eager, even the dominating kinds are still looking to check and see how it's going to fly. And this is the sociality of our lives, right? You can't count those looks. And yet they're the most important part of organizing social occasions, right? Okay. So this is a produced order of services. We can use the word the produced, but a lot of it is circumstantial and serendipitous. It's not like the deductive reasoning of Sir Francis Bacon or Sir Isaac Newton. Nor is it a negotiated social contract like Hobbes or Locke. Yet most contemporary social scientists are still lost inside of these social mythologies, what Garfinkel calls just so stories. But it's true that an actual social structure has come about, but it has the anonymity that Durkheim and Hegel referred to. So naturally accountable work as an exhibitable order is the cue. And then Garfinkel observes, and I want to emphasize this here because of the work we're all doing, that photographs reveal a line, but they don't provide the practical orientations that bring the line to life. That is, you've got the photographs, you've got these looks, for example. You almost have the practical orientation in those looks. That's why I like them. But in fact, the practical orientation is much deeper than that. So our research needs to retain the dynamism, the local ordering. So a question we might ask ourselves is, what kind of things are available that do not permit photographs or videotape to capture them? This is a question that Garfinkel asks a lot. I think he's the only one asking. Actually, we all are saying, yeah, aren't you giving us enough trouble? You have to throw this one out too.
Say it again.
What kinds of things are available that do not permit photographs or videotape to capture? That is
anything which is not visual.
Well, it's what's
available in what sense then?
that the available that we can appreciate if we go there, that we could capture and study and know something, learn something about what the orientation is, what the looks of the world is. What is it that a good surfer is seeing that allows them to recognize a wave as one that could be ridden as opposed to one that's just going to close out and smash you? I mean, it's hard to get inside people's heads, but because this work is social, it's ought to be available at some point. The point here to take is that don't think that everything is on the tape.
Well, maybe that's the problem, even in the way you're wording it now, is that it's not necessarily a seeing thing anyway. It could be a feeling, in the sense of touching feeling.
Yeah.
And I know in surfing, for example, sometimes a wave suddenly becomes a lot better than it might have been before because you've waited a long time, and so you'll just take it because because you want to get something, or it's time to go in, or whatever, and so
especially that.
And so there's issues of temporality there which we can't necessarily see, so we don't know if we're watching.
So how do you get access to those issues?
Sure.
You can get access to them, but you're not going to find them on the videotape.
No.
But can't you argue that this is actually not a social case? Because
Not what?
it's not a social phenomenon, because every surfer assesses the water and the waves on their experience. And on their experience they judge if they go or not. And sometimes people go because they have not enough experience, and then they get into trouble, or they don't go because they don't think they should go, and then they're in trouble as well. They have a different kind of trouble. So in a way it could be that in a way, same as a congregational phenomenon, like entering a freeway.
Yeah.
You do your stuff. Everybody does their stuff.
Yeah.
So if you look from the outside, it looks very social, but actually it's a lot of individual activity.
Yeah, except that
But
there's
in the freeway, of course, you have other people in a way.
a surfer who takes off on a particular way. Let's say you're out there, you're not getting any waves, you're really getting pissed. The really small day, and you can see the wind is going to come up. It's already starting, and it's going to be over before you know it, and you haven't gotten any good rides. And this 13-year-old just paddles out, and he gets the first wave. It goes for like pipeline, but it's only 2.5 feet high. And you were seeing those waves as being unrideable. That little squirt taught you that all of a sudden those waves are rideable. And so you just have to be a little more energetic, that's part of it, paddle a little harder and quicker maybe. But once he shows you that, all of a sudden like the Doppler shift of a train going by, all those waves are transformed into, oh my God, what a great day. Every wave is rideable. And then you get 6 rides, boom, 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 that you never would have gotten if that other guy hadn't come out. So that's social.
Yeah, but not everything is social.
No.
So, and that's you cannot get the feeling of the water or the smell in a place. You cannot get it on tape, and all these kind of parameters on which you do certain kind of decisions.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they are in the physical world, and you need to have some kind of knowledge to do certain kind of things with it.
I mean, as I understand it anyway, is that I would agree, but it's not just the looks of things, that wording itself may be too limiting. It's the feelings of things, the experiencing of things, the temporality and so on, which are all part of how we're doing something. So I'm quite happy to believe that these are things which are difficult for us to capture and that aren't just on the video. And for something like surfing, and it's not just surfing, of course, that it applies to, but it's issues of timing, how long you've waited. You can't just see, but you can feel the swell of the water. You can't just see how much water's behind the wave, but you can feel that in the swell. And other parts of life have their own other versions of that same thing. So if we're interested in objects, it's the textuality, the materiality of something, how it feels in my hand.
Yeah, it's all about
some of that you can see with how I'm gripping it. Some of it you can't, because it's known to me in the touching and the feeling, which isn't visible to someone who's got that on video necessarily, and which you're not going to get by asking me about it afterwards either.
Yeah, I wonder how a surgeon teaches doing surgery, for example.
Yeah. Well, there's some advance in that, but it's pretty difficult, I guess, knowing that sort of tactile, kinesic aspects.
Anyway, I think the warning here is that there is work involved in the line, and the photographs in this case, can help you get access to that work, but it doesn't exhaust the task you're facing. And don't create a bad metaphysics out of the few items that you can find via the tape, but keep looking. Okay, one final comment before we break. He raises on 259 this term that comes up from time to time in the middle of the page on judgmental dopes. I'm not sure where it is on the page, but I'm sure it is.
What are we looking for? Judgmental dopes?
Yeah. Recently, in an article, Michael Lynch said that that this is not for the purpose of glorifying the cleverness of people in our new model of social action. That a lot of people like this notion of judgmental dopes. I'm sure it's there.
Yeah, it's
259, 2/3 down.
yeah, 10 lines above conclusion.
Yes.
1 line below arithmetic.
Right.
A few words ahead of properties.
Right before.
Neither way psychiatric.
Lynch's comments on this is he's reacting. He said a lot of people get very excited and they kind of wave the flag. Oh boy, judgmental dopes. We ethnomethodologists take people not as judgmental dopes, but as full-fledged human beings. So we're respecting them, and to some extent that's true. But he says basically this is to say, don't believe in your models. Don't use this term and create a new model of social action in which people are not judgmental dopes. That would just reproduce the problem at another level. He says the point is, quote, to abandon all models of social actors that rely on stable and unified theoretical structures. And I mention this here because, when we write up our reports, our tendency is just before we send it off to, and the more respected the journal, the more we're required to do this kind of generalizing, we create these stable and unified theoretical structures to pin our notions on. And so we need to not do that. So let me offer you, along these lines, what I call Macbeth's advice, which is about the best I've heard, when he says, quote, I stand midway between treating people as judgmental dopes and treating people as heroes. Right? They're not heroes either. Don't treat people as heroes, but they're not dopes either. So you want to contrast Garfinkel's version of the cue with the cue as a set of rules that people follow blindly, which is how you kind of, in everyday life, think it is. So that takes us to a more radical reformulation of the question, what are rules? Which is not only the typical sociological question, but probably the question that Garfinkel started out with from his career. But keep in mind that people don't act because they're rules. Rather, they're rules because people act. So you want to find the rules in situated occasions. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with the surfer study. Okay, let's take a break and then we'll do chapter 9.
And the last thing, people will say, if you were to ask them, what are the rules of being in a queue? It's a question you can ask people, and I reckon they'll have an answer. And they'll say things like first in gets served first, and you have to find the back of the line. And
do you think you get that answer
I reckon,
in India?
No. But maybe you ask a different question there. But here, so for me, that's one thing, and someone might say that's evidence for being the rules. But people still have to enact them. They still have to realise them. They still have to know them in the doing of it. On particular occasions, particular sites or whatever. And so that for me is the thing that's really distinctive, that distinguishes any idea of rules that might be held by a sociologist or someone who thinks that there are these things set out there, and then what ethnomethodologists might do is that there's the actual doing of it, the realisation of whatever it is that's known that has to be done.
Okay.
But if you go after accountability and you say, okay, what would you do if, sometimes there are people and you don't know if they're part of the queue or not, and you ask them.
Yeah.
And they tell you, no, I'm standing here and waiting, or they say, no, I'm just waiting for somebody else. In a way, there is accountable behavior, and that's in a way what you could call a rule. And there's things where you say, well, this doesn't really matter, it's not accountable, it's just a certain way. Couldn't you get access to rule kind of things by looking at accountability?
You mean by root, you mean like
rules? Get at rule things by
the principles of rule governance, something like that.
Well, what are the rules for them come out in moments where something's made accountable or whatever? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Okay. This is a good discussion. I would say there's the rule as governed as there's a rule governed behavior of the sociological theorists.
Right.
There's the rule governed behavior as the lay ideology of the people in the situation. They're producing mythologies for themselves. And then there's what they're really doing. And that's what you're trying to get at. And I would answer, yeah, you're right. They are doing something. Otherwise, I'd probably give up studying the surfers, right? They're doing something, and it's uniform and repeatable, but it's incredibly complicated. And it's almost comes at the end of the action. It doesn't come at the start of the action. There's principles kind of, except that the principles are actually contradictory. They negate each other. They're competitive. And the selection of which one has priority is a highly situated affair, situated even if you rule out the strategic aspects of situatedness and just deal with the ethical interests of situatedness. So I'd say there's probably three things. These really repetitive structurings. There's the local ideology, and then there's the sociologist theorizing. Yeah.
I mean, in a way, we talk about the argument, which was the death of artificial intelligence, that people for a while thought they could, in a way, create behavior, and then figured out it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And why doesn't it work? Because of these kind of contingencies.
Because there's something wrong with people.
Yeah.
Well, it's like coming back, as I always will, to this in the supermarket here, where you have to put that little barrier between your goods and someone else's goods.
Oh, that's a big thing
Right,
here.
I keep coming back to that because I noticed something else about it the other day. Is that the rule? If you said to people, was that someone would say, if you haven't done it, oh, you have to put, they'll reach over and they'll put it there.
Yeah.
Or if you're a real idiot, they might have to tell you, oh, you should put that there. But in fact, you don't have to, because if their goods have moved far enough along the conveyor belt that there's clearly a visual gap, then you can get away with not putting it there because my stuff is here.
I
and
haven't
your
got
stuff
away
is
with
there.
it yet.
Or if
Depending on if there's someone behind you.
depending on someone behind you, if there's no one there, then you
can do
you don't do it. But sometimes if someone appears, then there'll be the like this sort of thing.
Well,
even if it is far.
Okay, so the big thing is the exhibited character of it, and that exhibited character is in the sound of the thud as they put it down, right? I'm not just helping to organize. I'm teaching you how to do it, right?
And you've really failed if they smack you on the back of the head.
That's why I really want some of the people to capture how the local population is educating the Syrians on how to do these mundane things in everyday life. I mean, if I, as an American, am having problems with this, imagine somebody from used to little shops in rural Syria are dealing with it. Of course, a smile helps a lot, but even so, like I learned in Lecce, Italy, things work out badly even when you mean well.
Well, I'm teaching. There are a lot of Syrian refugees where I'm staying.
Yeah, I know.
And
more every day.
my cultural thing that emerges is turning off the light switch. So I'm always turning off light switches because they apparently don't do it. So I'm always, even in rooms where I'm not, I'll reach past and turn it off.
Why don't you keep
That's
notes?
apparently my problem.
Why don't you take notes and pass it along, and it might help some of the folks who are studying their situation.
Sorry, notes for whom? I'm not going to write notes. I'm very bad at writing
Switch off the light
notes.
and write notes.
Yeah, please turn off light. No, I won't do that.
But that's really more like a personal ideology.
Yeah, sure.
Light should be turned off.
Or is it just me, or is it a cultural, power saving, water saving, blah blah blah? I don't know.
But you do it.
But all I know is I do it and they don't.
I do it to save money.
Yeah.
Well, don't make notes then, but just tell Rainer over coffee or something.
That's a good excuse for a cup of
But
coffee.
keep on producing that audible outbreak.
So yeah.
But it's quite
again.
But in the supermarket, it's quite intrusive actually, because you'll observe people getting really close to other people, and in Denmark we tend not to do that. But in the supermarket, people will actually get really intimate and then put down this divider between the groceries.
Right.
So it's actually quite, I wouldn't say intimidating, but
Yeah.
we wouldn't tend to get
And
that
the other
close.
thing is if I
that's
know from
interesting.
experience that it's an action that I'm supposed to have done, and maybe I've decided not to do for some reason, for someone to then to come and do it, they've kind of appropriated what was rightfully my action and my chosen it. So then they're making a judgment, and so then I get,
But
I didn't think it was necessary.
I have to admit, where I do my shopping in the US, they do the same kind of thing. They have the same kind of elements.
Oh, when it comes to self-righteous indignation,
No, I mean this kind
we
of...
are second to none.
No, this kind of things, putting your thing in between your and other people's stuff. I know that
Yeah.
in the US.
But there's
We have it in Australia, but it doesn't matter as much. And there's one store where it seems to matter more, and that's Aldi, the kind of European model store.
They go
Yeah,
along
yeah,
with
which I go to
yeah.
sometimes, quite oddly. Anyway,
In Holland, there was even a debate about what to call it officially, so that it could be promoted as an actual thing that you needed to do.
what are they?
I can't remember what they've called it, but they actually, there was some society who set up some committee to decide. Okay, what
Is it a separator or a divider? A barrier? A
No,
barrier?
civic-minded rule governance, right?
Yeah, I can believe it.
We need a name for this thing.
I can't remember what it's called.
Okay, coffee.
Okay, so let me tell you about this one. This is the chapter that people give up on, okay? And they give up on it partly because it's sometimes hard to figure out what he's talking about. And they give up on it in the end because they conclude that they don't really need to know this much about Galileo, right? and so it came about in my discussion with Harold. I said, which chapter do you think is the most important one? He said, well, at first he said, no, I wouldn't say one's more important. And then he says, no, that's not true. One chapter really is more important. And he picked this chapter, right? And it's the hardest one. So I think it's worth giving it some time. I wanted to title our discussion, What Did We Learn About Discovering's Work in Garfinkel's Galileo Inclined Plane Experiment? Because the object of his research in this case is to describe the workplace specifics of discovering work. What is it to discover something that you didn't plan for, right? And he says that's what real science does. And he used to distinguish between the discovering sciences and the non-discovering sciences, and sociology's among the non-discovering sciences because we provide words that, what's going on?
Is Dennis in or not?
Oh, he's in.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
We provide words that that guarantee that we find what we're looking for. That is, he says, sociology is a talking science, not a discovering science. So people asked him, so what do you mean discovering sciences? So he developed this project with his students. I'm not sure all the students that were involved. There might be a list. Certainly, Livingston was involved, perhaps Michael Lynch. And a lot of Garfinkel's ideas are developed in conversation, in discussions with his students. They found out that the first thing they did was they went and looked at physics classes, and particularly lab exercises in affiliated to physics classes to see what science was. But Garfinkel discovered that the University Department of Physics teach in their laboratory exercises things that aren't much better than what sociology is doing. That is, they're not discovering work. They, in fact, lack the just what of discovering work in physics. That the laboratory exercises surely are filled with workplace specifics, and they took a lot of photos of the labs. But the discovering work that is involved in physics is lost there, since the result is always a foregone conclusion. Right? The students know that there's a right answer. And there's a world of difference between an experiment first time through and an experiment as a foregone conclusion. Right? And that they were capturing just experiments as foregone conclusions, and they weren't learning anything about discovering work, even though physics is a discovering science. So where can they learn about that work? I mean, life is first time through, right? Everything's first time through, right? And yet It's a different thing when you already know how it's going to come out. Even the classic accounts of Galileo's work that they found in textbooks and the like present his work as foregone conclusions, as if Galileo knew all along what he was doing, right? And so it was difficult to recover the discovering part of Galileo's work, which includes the fact that he was not always certain about whether his experiments would succeed or not. And so they decided to do one of his experiments, and they did the inclined plane demonstration. And they compared what they did with the classic accounts offered of what Galileo did, and they found out that those classic accounts leave out their fully situated character, their embodied practices, the meaningful horizon, the horizon of meaning. Can I put that up there? It should have been up there.
Yeah.
Meaningful horizon. Okay. And fundamentally the congregational work of all the parties that participated, and they discovered when they read Galileo's notes that the we was that Galileo kept referring to we this, we this, we this. So there was a collaborative phenomenon there, and that none of the classic accounts is just this master scientist with some special Renaissance robes, probably purple, doing these experiments, and so they wanted to find something more than what they were able to find in the laboratory exercises, the work of which consisted mostly of detailing steps to a foregone conclusion, and so in that regard weren't very different from the sociology that they'd been doing most of their lives. One feature that identifies the work of actual scientific experiments first time through is that, Garfinkel tells us, the scientist can lose the phenomenon. It's pretty hard for sociologists to lose the phenomenon. I mean, because whatever we find, we turn into a result. It's such a word-governed activity that we have much more control of things. To understand what scientists are actually up against, what the astronomer is up against, when they want to find that, in Garfinkel's case, the optical pulsar or a new star or a new galaxy, as their day's work, given the few hours that they've received permission from the observatory to actually use this multi-million-dollar instrumentation, that's a lot tougher than Garfinkel's wife saying the party's coming tonight. You've got to finish putting that chair together by then. I mean, this is like your one opportunity. And so if you don't achieve it, you can fail. So the reality of the serious possibility of failure that inhabits the horizon of understanding of scientific work explains a lot about the probative character of that work that is identifying of what it is to do real science. And Garfinkel offers an anecdote about a microbiology lab. I don't think it's in here, but he offered it in one of his lectures, that found two enzymes.
Oh, that's in.
Oh, it is here?
264.
Okay, good.
And directly under the losing the phenomenon.
Yes. Right, exactly. Okay, so he's got it here. So the anecdote about a microbiology lab is that they found two enzymes when current knowledge knew that there would be only one enzyme. So this is a discovery, important. But their finding took place on a Friday. And on the following Monday, And for the whole of the following week, when they kept redoing the experiment, which is what scientists have to do, they only got one enzyme. That is, they lost the phenomenon. So what do you do when you lose the phenomenon?
You should come in on Saturday if you found something really exciting. If you found something really exciting, you keep working.
No, they're like days in the holidays, right? Nothing is more sacred. But he said that this why they only got one enzyme was a why that gave them insomnia. Then they discovered that the sales representative for the manufacturing and filtering columns had come in on the weekend and changed the filter, as I guess he's supposed to do, without telling them. And somehow his new filter had filtered out the second enzyme. And so they had a simple solution of they put back the first filter and then they found the second enzyme again. Okay. So it's an interesting case. Yesterday I spent all day long working in Final Cut Pro on this videotape I did of one of the top specialty coffee tasters in Italy. And he has his own lab, and he produces a number of blends, quite a few really unique blends, and he sells them to particular bars, so that bars have their own identity. Okay, so he develops a unique blend for a particular bar in consultation with the owner of the bar. Bar in Italy is for coffee, although I think they sell drinks as well, but people are drinking coffee. They come up with a unique blend, and it's pretty good because it's specialty coffee, and it's not that expensive. It's more expensive than the normal, but it's a good value. And he got the report back that it was bitter, and he said, "Oh, come on, it's not. It can't be bitter." And so he tasted it, and it was bitter. He could taste the bitter. His co-taster could taste the bitter. So then the question was finding out why it was bitter. So he said immediately it had to be one of the beans was over roasted, because sometimes you roast too much, you get more bitterness. So he went and said, "Let's go find each bean and taste them." And they said, "No, first let's look at the mix, the blend. Let's go look at how that was roasted." So they got the sample how it was roasted, and he said, "That's awfully light. I don't see any dark beans in there. It was a blend of 5 beans. I don't see anything that could be the problem. They're all very lightly roasted." But then for confirmation, they used the colorimetro, they call it, the color meter, that gives you a quantitative number for, I don't think there's any other kinds of numbers, but for what the color is, what the level of roast is. And it's very useful. And it was good for their research process. It doesn't tell you everything about coffee, because it doesn't tell you what's inside the bean, the level of roast. And there's the profile. You can get a dark outside and still be unroasted on the inside. So he said, "No, look, even the color meter says that this is lightly roasted. So it's not the roast." And then he lost the phenomenon. He was there clueless. He had a big customer complaining. He agreed with the customer that there was a problem. He didn't know what was making it bitter, because they've had this blend for quite a while and it's not bitter. And then he went to the roaster. And then the roaster said, "Oh," it's kind of similar to this. "Oh, I roasted that on Friday afternoon, and we needed to bag them before the weekend. And so I usually let them sit out overnight so that they can air out some of the phenols and kind of cure, and then I bagged them the next day. But this one I didn't have a chance. They only aired for 2 hours." And so he said, there's some effect of the roasting process, and you get the vacuum packed bags that keeps them fresh. And so then he opened up another bag and tasted that. Yes, it was bitter. And then he said, let's leave this out overnight, and come back in the morning and see if the bitterness has gone away, as a confirming thing, right? So this is coffee tasting as a discovering practice, right? So, but so there's real world phenomena in which first time through you don't know how it's going to come out, and when you're operating at the cutting edge of science, you don't know how things are going to come out. A scientist reported, he writes on 266, that I'm always thinking about how methods and results are tied to each other, right? And so good scientists are often ethnomethodologists, that is, people who study their own methods. Its interest is, I mean, what we're doing in ethnomethodology is not just ethnography, right? Ethnography is fine. I've got no quibbles with ethnography. But we have an interest that's more narrowly drawn. We're interested in studying the methods that people use. It's more technical than an ethnographer's interest. On 266 in the middle of the page, question. The ethnography would not do. We were not going to settle for the ethnography. That is, they want to know the horizon of meaning along with the practices that constitute the methods. That is, and we don't want to just talk about what they're doing. They want to view those situations where the scientist loses the phenomenon. Where does the new star go away? How does it disappear from the sheet of paper with all these mathematical notations? And especially, not just that it goes away, but what's the horizon of understanding of the scientist as it goes away? The next line of 266. We wanted, for losing the phenomenon, to come upon it as they would come upon it. And not they, generally speaking, but say as a limpid chemist, in the particular place where the chemistry was done, would find himself in the presence of a phenomenon that had been there before. So not peeking through the window like an ethnographer or like an anthropologist who visits people and there's no indication that he was really there in the narrative that he produces, but rather what it is to do science. So the problem is, how do you gain access to that lived horizon of understanding that the laboratory scientists are living? Fortunately, it has an answer. You become a physicist, right? It only takes 7 years, right? Oh, well, you can go for geology. That's only 3 years, right? And Garfinkel had a student who did that. Stacey Burns got a law degree from Harvard, right? She's now the professor, past chair of her department in sociology. She didn't go there to be a lawyer. Eric Livingston got an MA in mathematics. But it's not easy to do, and we learn how not easy it is every time we try another project. Fortunately, I'm already a surfer, right? But anyway, they decided to come upon it in this case by doing Galileo's inclined plane demonstration of the real motion of free-falling bodies. Most sociology of science studies have been studies of literatures and not studies of the contingencies of an actual experiment. So they went looking for how they could land themselves smack in the middle of some real contingencies in order to discover what an experiment looks like as something first time through. That is, in order to recover the horizon of experience of the discovering of the scientists. The scholars who have mastered a literature become accountable to the literature as their professional priority. and they have professional obligations to not find anything interesting in Garfinkel's study. But if Garfinkel himself sorry, not Garfinkel. If Galileo was here watching us do our sociological studies of science, I think as eloquent as Husserl and Feyerabend and all these people are about who study science, I think they would really like what Garfinkel's doing in this chapter. I think Galileo would say, no, he doesn't find what Galileo found. He found another first time through, but he found the futural orientation of, and the possibilities of failure, which it would not be available by the more literary approaches, by what Garfinkel calls on 268 exemplary analytic studies. Exemplary being they're brilliant people who are thinking, in compelling ways, but they've still lost what it is that scientists are doing, what it is that Galileo is doing. If you look on the first full paragraph on 268, and each, like its predecessors, repeats a standing incongruity of the received literature in just the same descriptively analytic way that each prior study satisfies the demand that it be adequately and evidently instructive of Galileo's inclined plane demonstration. It misses, and therein neglects, as local worksite specific, uniquely adequate shop floor practices of that demonstration's achievement, the achievements two uniquely specifying workplace constituents. That is, although scholarly in identifying, they fail to specify the demonstration's actual work. What is the actual work? What is the worksite specific details of Galileo's experiment? What is real motion of bodies in free fall as the in vivo phenomenon? That's where we have to keep our sight. And then you get this long list, which at first read seems a little absurd. Let's read it on that last paragraph on 268. All, in italics, covers things that roll, like billiard balls, golf balls, and walnuts. Their staging areas, places on the board to mark where a roll was stopped, a grooved track, its uniform depth, width, and smoothness in different comparable lengths, 20 usable feet of a 22-foot board purchased at a local lumberyard and safely transported without warning flags over the city streets to UCLA, uniformly straight for its entire 22-foot length. Proud of that one. The board's adjustable slope from 0 to 20 degrees with respect to a section of the floor that was flat for the board's entire length. Right? The floor can't be crooked either. Successive uses of measuring cord along the length of a roll after a train of balls had rolled the time distance. A positioned 35 millimeter camera for stills, a positioned video camera and monitor, timing protocols that provided collaborated instructed actions to describe correctly collecting, selecting, carrying to the release point, placing, releasing, following alongside a roll, watching to the listen to sounded roll, listening for sounded rolls by watching the sounds, reaching out and stopping certain sounded rolls, place markings, counted elapsed time and measuring roll distances, and the rest of the others. Imagine that what they ended up doing is there's a certain sound they kept hearing each time they rolled it right? That's what you were talking about. There's these intangible things that it's hard to see them doing. There's a sound. It's got nothing to do with a word or a concept. But it's that, my God, that sound just keeps coming up. It's like baseball players swinging the bat, and as soon as you hear that crack, you know what's happening on the field. You don't even have to be watching. You can be in your popcorn. It's all very mundane. And it's so unimportant that that theorists, these exemplary analytic theorists, don't want to think this list through. I mean, and I'll bet most people who read the chapter don't even read the list. I mean, they read the first couple and then skip to the end, right? Because what's interesting about this list, except every one is absolutely critical to the real possible failure of the ball rolling that could prove anything that we want to prove about how all these things roll. I note the hyphenation further down. We're not going to read the next paragraph. It goes on for the second paragraph. It kindly puts in a paragraph punctuation. But in the middle of 269, you get this sounded dash, listened dash to, and listened for balls watched and heard to be rolling away from their release and over their course to their single chord of a coherent crash, right? I mean, he elevates that chord, that sound, into the word chord, and then has all those italics because so much went into getting that sound, but it was just one phenomenon, and it's the longest one because it's the central phenomenon of what their experimentation came upon in order to do the experiment. And this is what's meant by coherent details. That is, this is how the scientists working to get everything, to get all these contingent details to work together. All those particulars of the phenomena field work as one phenomenon. So the hyphens are valid. It's not just trying to be difficult. I mean, that chord is like a church bell tolling each time you do it correctly, like a celebration. But then the interesting thing is they went back and read more of Galileo and got his own notes, and on 272 you have a citation from Galileo. It's somebody's doctoral dissertation, and I presume they translated the Italian. And you get a list that's just like Garfinkel's list. It's a different list because they have different materials, but it's like it. A piece of wooden molding of scantling, about 12 braccia, that's an arm span wide, and 3 finger breadths thick, was taken. On its edge was cut a channel a little more than 1 finger in breadth. Having made this groove very straight, smooth, and polished, and having lined it with parchment, also as smooth and polished as possible, we rolled along it a hard, smooth, and very round bronze ball. Very round, right? Having placed this board in a sloping position by lifting one end, some 1 or 2 braccia above the other, we roll the ball. I mean, you might say Garfinkel's absurd for giving us all these details, but the master Galileo himself considered it important enough to include. So we have here then, at last, the real work of doing science, right? I mean, including the qualifying word "very," which is surely a local contingency. So you find revealed in Galileo's text the details that he and his cohort were facing. And these are given the name by Garfinkel, drawing on the Gestalt phenomenologist Aaron Gurvich, the figurationally coherent orderlinesses, right? and there are things, coherencies that are seen, not necessarily thought, sounded as well. I don't know if you can use the word figurationally in the case of a chord, but you might as well. And they don't get that coherence every time. They don't get that coherence by themselves. That is, their coherence is dependent upon a local praxis. And that's what the ethnomethodologist is trying to discover. What are effective scientific practices that produce science, that produce discoveries? What are the systems of activity that works? I mean, if I'm tolerated in the cupping room by coffee people, it's partly because they know they've got problems on their hands and they would like to come up with a little better system. So if I can deal with local practices to an extent that can improve their work, then it'll be worth it to have me so long as I keep quiet, stay in the background, don't talk, and don't film, right? Because filming can get people into trouble, right? So, and every situation, and we talked a number of seminars ago about the shop floor phenomenon at the Douglas plant in Los Angeles after the Vietnam War ended, and how they lost the phenomenon because they lost the local details, the local production practices. That is, these phenomenal field details are known to experts. They're recognized by experts, just like the surfable wave is known to surfing experts. And as the local praxis becomes routine, each element, each thing becomes a social fact, in Durkheim says. But these systems have a local production history. So they have a local order production cohort. And so we need to see the relationship between this independent social Durkheimian fact and this production cohort. He identifies two components of what he's calling the shop floor problem, and that is the objective measurement, right? And then the actual work of measuring. And you've got to have both because the measuring is embodiedly situated. That is, how to measure is a learned skill. In the case of professional coffee tasters, they asked me the question, okay, so are you in favor of forms or not? You know, I mean, it's an issue for them. They need good forms. They need a system in order to really do their job the best because there's so much going on, it's so complicated, you're not going to be able to ad hoc it. Everybody has a form, but then because they have a form and because the form generates numbers, almost magically, I'm fascinated by this. I won't talk about that now, but at some point, the form then stands for itself. And certainly, if you get a high number, then you're the producer selling your coffee. You don't take it any further at the auction for coffee than I got a 96, you know. I'm a 96. What that 96 means, nobody knows. But it's a number, and it's objective, so it's divorced from those practices. But there's very serious work they're doing. And it's work they're doing with a form, they're measuring. There's measurements, there's objective measurements, but the form succeeds, and I'm saying really succeeds for the purposes of objectivating the knowledge about coffee, but it succeeds because of the practices that they're doing, because of the expertise of people who know how to work with the form, who know what the flaws of the form is, who know how to fudge when you need to fudge in order to get the form to be knowledgeable. Because forms are sometimes stupid, right? So the question, I've not gone to a coffee company or a coffee society, I've not gone anywhere where I haven't heard the question, well, we're thinking of changing the form. We have some ideas about improvements of the form, right? This is an endless process, right? And so the forms are getting better and better. And some of the forms at this point are very, very good. But my argument is they're not good because of the form. They're good because of how they make themselves available to people who can become expert at using the form. Okay. So that's what Garfinkel's saying here. The first part of a pair, right? There's the measurement and then the work of measuring. And it's another case, remember I spoke in the Husserl talk about substituting objective expressions for occasional expressions? It's like just another point, and the form is an objective expression that substitutes for the local contingent production, and they help people communicate. They have a lot of benefits, but if they get too separate from the coffee, they're not going to know what the flavor is anymore, and that's a big danger to their business.
So you're saying the form is an objective measure or statement, or it's treated as such, and understood as such, and allowed to be as such?
Is there a difference? Maybe both?
I thought so, but I wasn't sure what you were saying.
Well, I think it is. I mean, it depends on what you mean by objective, and that has so many different meanings. But I would say that is objective. Objective is nothing more mystical or special than the result on the form. But of course, it has all these practices that go into it. But the point is that there's another objective, which is the objective that happens after all those practices are forgotten, right? And that was the point of, some of you may have read the optical pulsar paper, discovering an optical pulsar. I mean, the main point of that is that when they came to writing up the paper for publication, they completely redid the temporality of the discovering process. And they didn't even notice that these production practices were missing. That is, they produced a separate objective account that looked like it was far more inevitable than it really was. Right? They got lucky, and they didn't want their luckiness to be evident to their scientific colleagues, who probably knows it all along anyway. On 270, in the middle of the page, he says, just go to the middle where it says general, where the paragraph ends on general, and let's read that sentence. In classic studies, measurement practices are characteristically glossed with generic specifications of measurement in professional lexicons, right? The astronomer they have their lexicon. The coffee tasters have their lexicon. As essential invariant definitional properties of measurement in general. Okay? As if no humans played a role, right? That's sort of the intimation. And then this has a lot to do, not only because it's relevant, but because Livingston's work was developed in collaboration with Garfinkel at the time they were doing this experiment together. There's this Lebenswelt pair, which is a term from Husserl, even though Eric doesn't like to talk a lot about Husserl. The Lebenswelt is a notion that has to do with the accepted world, that is the world that gets its coherence, and he says there's two parts, the first pair part and the second pair part. He's talking about developing this in connection with mathematicians' proof. The mathematicians, just like a coffee taster, they can't think through all the problems of the proof without all these mathematical notations. Those mathematical notations carry their thinking, allow them to remember what they were thinking, and communicate what they were thinking, and build upon what they were thinking. They'd be nowhere without that notation, but when they're all done, you stand back, this is the proof, QED, as if this does it all by itself. But each phrase is indexical. Each phrase is based upon what the mathematicians are doing with it. That was Livingston's very important point. If you can manage to read all that math, right? So at that point, you have what Livingston and Garfinkel decided to call hybrid studies. And at one point, Garfinkel was going to do a whole book called Hybrid Studies in Ethnomethodology, right? So he gave me a call in my office at the University of Oregon. We want you to do a chapter where we're going to do hybrid studies. Well, what are hybrid studies? That is, the mathematician doesn't know what they're doing. The coffee taster doesn't know what they're doing. They're doing it with competence, but they don't realize the second component of what they're doing with the objectivated record of their thinking. And by pointing out to the scientist, by pointing out to the mathematician, by pointing out to the coffee taster, just what they're really doing, they can do it better. So that it's a hybrid study because they didn't know in just so many words that they were doing that, even though once you describe it to them, they recognize it. There's a note on page... I wanted to say that I got tickled. A professional in the coffee tasting world somehow got a hold of my article. The chapter in the 9th chapter of I think it's 9th, might be 8th of More Studies in Ethnomethodology on coffee tasting, and he took a line out of it and he puts it on his emails now at the bottom as a quotable quote, right? And I got such a kick out of that because it means that what Garfinkel was saying about hybrid studies is actually true. That in fact we're finding out and describing for people what they know already, but don't have the self-reflection about it. And what the sentence he put in was, if during their efforts coffee tasters find something in the taste that resists being said, that perhaps even resists being organized into their discourse, that is where they focus their attention. Right? That's the discovery part of coffee tasting. So sociologists alone could never capture the detail that's needed because they're not mathematicians. But the sociologists can be taught by the practitioners, or they can observe deeply. And sometimes even then they can't, because they're so myopic, having accepted their own propaganda, that they can't see the second part. They're so busy numerating it and trying to get something that'll fit their computer programs that maybe they won't see it. But if we do it right, I think you can learn from the people what they're doing and then also contribute. So it's a cooperative effort. Sociology, like any other academic scientific discipline, needs their capacity to generalize in order to be a science. And we're not faulting them because we do it ourselves, right? I mean, it's not enough that, we just study something. We want to generalize. But it's not necessary that our interest in generic theory make those local practices invisible. We can see the local practices, describe them, understand them, and then if they are pertinent to some sociological theorizing, we can do that. It's not a sin to do it. It's only a sin, let's say, if our preoccupation with the theoretical makes the real world phenomena invisible. Okay. So let's look on 270 at the bottom. Because this is what the ethnomethodologists are contributing. It's 2 lines from the bottom on page 270. To display the demonstration's properties of social order, to make them examinable, to make them instructively observable benchwork, and to make this benchwork adequately articulate, requires the work site disciplinary expertise of both physics and sociology. So he's saying that to look at what Galileo's doing, what laboratory scientists are doing when they're doing their research, requires the disciplinary expertise of both fields, sociology and science, sociology and surfers. And that makes them hybrid studies. And of course, you're studying scientists, so they're generalizing all the time. That's what they discovered in the optical pulsar paper. Scientists must generalize. That's part of what they're doing. They must measure. Phenomenal things have to be reformatted into units that can be measured. That's part of science also. But you can do that and lose contact with the phenomenon, or you can do that and preserve the phenomenon. Okay. So the achievement, the scientific achievement, has to do, Garfinkel concludes, with the probative character of measuring's coherent details. That is, the measuring must be done so it's also an inquiry. So the measuring is an inquiry. It's not like all measurement's bad. That's not what we're saying. It's also an inquiry, but we have to make sure it stays, that it retains its probative character. Okay. On 271. Um, 11 lines from the bottom. On the topic of the shop floor specifics. Exercising an amnesia for shop floor specifics of practical theorizing and practical actions, the received demonstration teaches an appreciation of universal science in physics and natural science. It teaches novices the work of discovering science by celebrating universal science in physical and natural science as a foregone conclusion. And that amnesia is part of the process. The missed work of measuring is given in Garfinkel's text. This important work of measuring is given a name, and the name's really crazy, almost funky. And it's at that point people won't finish the chapter. It's called metrological. Did you come upon that crazy word? Right? It occurs several times on 277. Garfinkel was a little annoyed at how people never, always misunderstood it. It has to, let's see, where is it on? It's
Found fungibilities.
Line 5.
line 5. Yeah, the identifying. Yeah, it's not just metrological work, but it's the critical, pivotal. It's the metrological work as the heart of the practice that identifies the work that the scientists are doing. Metrological has to do with measuring. That is, it's a methodology for measuring. It's how the scientists are after the metrics. They're after, the quantitative measuring that can be done. The praxis they have for finding those metrics. That's the metrological work. And to have metrological work that's probative is very important. Okay? And of course, let's not lose sight of the fact that scientists usually work cooperatively, at least the hard scientists, and probably most in the end. On the bottom of 271, you get this elaborated version of this, 3 lines from the bottom, the work of a local order production endogenous population cohort. That is, it's their work is being concerted. Their concert, their accord doesn't happen by itself. It's not inevitable. It's something they accomplish together. And of course, they have their own particular interests, and when they share those interests, their work proceeds in a successful way. And then if you like, you could apply that formula we used last time with the brackets, that somehow at part of the social amnesia operates when they write up the report, is to turn the Galileo's incline falling bodies, and then you have the metrological work, and then you have a reduced version, and then you end up with only that in the published paper. So, and that then means you lose the avalanche of particulars that was really what you were doing, the rolling balls, the balls that have to be very round, according to Galileo. That is so round that golf balls won't work, walnuts won't work, that you'll only get the experiment to work if you find the right ball. Or, as Garfinkel found out, if you leave the board outside in the garage and you have a night of heavy rain and it's starting to absorb and some parts are absorbing more moisture than others, it won't roll well and you'll lose the phenomenon. All these details, and you won't even know why you lost the phenomenon. It'll be like, boy, the world's phantasmic. So we're locating the phenomenon in the data. You have something, but the clarity of what you have is sometimes less and sometimes more. The clarity of the acidity of the coffee is sometimes more and sometimes less. If you had a heavy night's drinking the previous night, maybe you can't taste any acidity. The world looks different with looking at it like that and looking at it with the hatch marks. For example, take BP's case, right? BP, right, had this great oil spill off the coast of New Orleans, right? A disaster for everybody. And of course now all the PR is saying all the species are making a miraculous comeback. It's really wonderful. The earth heals itself. Don't blame us anymore. But you were using instrumentation that they were engineers, serious engineers that are paid big bucks, and they tested that stuff, But there's a difference between testing an engineering mechanism when there's never been a problem and it works just fine, and going back and retesting the same instrumentation after you've just polluted 100,000 kilometers of ocean, I mean, square kilometers, I don't know what it was, but it was like from Mexico to Florida. And then the BP scientists, oh yeah, we see the weaknesses. Yeah, this was the wrong kind of plastic. All of a sudden, the BP people were forced to go back to that to find what the problem was. But they didn't have the motive to recover those looks until there was actually a problem as serious as there was. Anyway,
That's, for me, not only is that very nice, and for me personally very engaging, because I've done a lot of reading and writing on catastrophes and disasters and accidents and so on. And so part of my deep passion is exactly that link, is that at least in most of the things that I've read about, and that one as well, and this is true for most catastrophes and disasters that you'll read about in the news, the factors which led to it almost always were either known or massively knowable, the contributing factors, if anybody had paid any attention. So like this, when the space shuttles blew up or whatever, that was, they knew what the weaknesses were, but management, senior engineers didn't listen, etc., etc. So in all these cases that I look at, it's those details that sort of suddenly become important after the event, that at the time, if you tried to tell them, they would have said weren't interesting, they're just the stuff that we know.
More interesting, I mean, even boring.
And so my difficulty has been in trying to get people to understand, the people being organisations, industry or whatever, that these are the kinds of details which should be relevant to them, and which would be revelatory to them for indicating where things might possibly go wrong. But they just don't care until after the event. And what you'll see, and I almost started paying myself $1 every time I read it, you'd read at the end of the articles where they'll say, we're going to go back and fix this procedure, or change this, we'll fix this little widget or whatever, and then you'll get this sentence in English anyway, so it never happens again. This is what they'll say. Almost the last line of the report, it'll say, so it never happens again. You know, or it doesn't matter what aspect it is, it could be technical, it could be a legal thing currently with murders or sexual assault, or we're going to change the bail laws.
Or Secret Service.
You know, so it never happens again. But the point is that you could have changed them before it happened that time, because the things that you're now discovering were knowable or known before that catastrophe happened. So my biggest struggle with all this is trying to get people to go back to be interested in the details of these practices, but people, they're not able to see the relevance of it, at least in aviation anyway. To give a really good example, I wrote a paper on a friendly fire incident from the Iraq War, in which 2 American aircraft fired on a British tank convoy, and I wrote about how that happened in sort of interactional, technological kind of terms. Then it turns out the exact same kind of incident happened in the earlier Iraq War, in the first one, in the early 90s or whatever, almost the exact same incident. And then lo and behold, whatever it was a few years ago, a very equivalent kind of thing happened when I guess it was an American pilots again who fired on a Pakistani checkpoint and kind of killed 18 Pakistani soldiers, allies at the time. I don't know where people stand now. But the point was that from my first reading anyway, it was the precise same set of circumstances that happened again. And it would continue to happen because they don't understand the details of what it is that they're doing in the way that you worded or Garfinkel had said or whatever. And for some reason they're not interested in knowing. Or at least the psychologists that they work with have all the answers, and so whenever I try to deal with it, we know all that, we do all that, we don't need to know that stuff that you've got. And so I had no chance of dealing with these guys, you know. And with the, like I remember the air traffic controllers in Australia, when I contacted them and I said, look, I'm doing this research, you might be interested, and they said, we don't see any need for this research at all, blah, 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 and then lo and behold, a few years later, there's some sort of communicative mishap, and some plane almost bashes into a mountain or whatever. So anyway, so I just want to say that for me is this exciting thing about how people ignore that, they go straight to that, but it's only when some catastrophe, and you gave a disaster example, that they then go back and try and recover those kinds of details as if they somehow mattered to them, when in reality they don't.
Well, even like in the last few weeks we've had, talking about planes crashing into mountains, the German wings incident where they've now gone back and they've redone a lot of the procedures.
Right. But because it was totally inconceivable to them that somebody would ever do that, would ever lock the door from the inside, even though I could tell you of at least 2 incidences, one involving Egypt, Air I think it was, but certainly one involving a a Singapore airline, Silk Air, a subsidiary, where the exact thing happened, where some pilot took control. And there was a serious cargo one as well, a cargo aircraft that nearly crashed when someone went nuts in the cockpit. So even knowing that these things happen, they don't design the doors such that there can be some sort of override from outside, only known to blah, blah, blah.
Could it be that, I mean, this is a very convincing story. I just wonder if there are so many possible, relevant coincidences, so you in a way give up and say, well, we cannot control the world anyway, because in a way somehow going back and saying, oh, we could have fixed it, makes mainly sense if you can say, in principle, we can fix everything. Could it be that they have given up and said, well, we can't fix anyway? So afterwards we get a good explanation for what you're doing. So it's more in a kind of...
In principle, I get it. I know you've said this to me before when I've been on one of my rants. But it's in principle, you can fix more things than they do. If we devoted the same level of funding and expertise to discovering details of practices in technological situations or whatever that we do into other things, health-related things or whatever they might be, then we might know an awful lot more. People still try to fund the cure for cancer, right? Even though you might say that they haven't so far, but it doesn't stop them trying. I think there's more that we could know and more that we could do. Anyway.
Yeah. No, great. How do we repair? I mean, how do we contribute to the situation? What contribution can this perspective make? And it's, how do we get people, including ourselves, and maybe especially ourselves, to retain the attention to the coherent, situated orderlinesses? Why do we rule them out and substitute these objective orders that I don't know, sell better or sound better, or it has to do with what we were talking about in the Husserl seminar, his call in the crisis of the formal transcendental logic for radical self-understanding. How do we get people to constantly pull the rug out from under them? Well, that's what Socrates was talking about. How do you get people to constantly not reify their thinking? Reification is the problem, and we're all practitioners of it. I mean, I think there's a way that we can do it, but then, we're not. Professionals are not supposed to care about actually helping people, right? At least I'm sometimes criticized for being too, I don't know what. But I do think about, it's not that we want to give up the metrological practices. The problems aren't with measuring, it's how we're measuring. And there's ways to measure without losing the phenomenon. And though that's an historical institution, I mean, we can change that.
I mean, to stick to that example, they're regularly drawing on these things when you'll see some finding. I've just been reading one this morning from Cognitive Science or whatever, where they said, we've got different results, but that's because our subjects were blah, 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 all under the age of 10 or had red hair or something like that. But the point is they then go back to a particular kind of contingency in their data of how they collected it or whatever, which led to the different findings. So it wasn't so important for the first study. They had their generated facts, which were then acted on. But then 10 years later, there'll be another study with some slight variation, different size billiard balls or whatever it is here. And suddenly that's the thing that makes a difference. And so that then becomes the same way. They then go back to this and they look at the little details and realise just how much they actually mattered for what they did and what they found. Yeah. And I think a lot of the time science works like that. Yeah.
Well, I hope we figure it out before it's too late. That's all I have to say. Okay. But there are objective phenomena. When balls roll, it's there for everyone to see. It's repeatable, it's measurable, so you can do science like this. As Mannheim said, science can give things a firm profile by stabilizing our understanding. But the problem then is in our interest in social order, which leads us to stabilize our understanding. how do we damage our insight? How do we limit our insight by that stabilizing, by that taming of the local circumstances? How do we lose the phenomena? Somehow, to do science, our job is to make something general out of the local, right? And then we lose sight of that local. So like I'm saying, we can do the general part, but not instead of. If you look on 277, the paragraph just above the middle of the page. The autochthonous order of properties of Galileo's inclined plane experiment provide for Galileo's experiment in the shop floor constituents of the law of falling bodies. The constituents specify the coherence of the experiment's details in the experiment's generality. So the generality is part of it, but it's a generality in which the constituents haven't been lost. Endogenously, that is, they're there. Endogenously means without introducing into the work in its course, eschewing, making no use of, exercising an indifference to definitions, schemata, models, principles, analogons, etc., that are ordinarily designed and administered to rescue the demonstration's generality from the circumstantiality of its details, right? It doesn't need that rescue. We somehow feel that the science is in rescuing the generality from the circumstantiality, but the circumstantiality is the heart of the matter. You can have the generality in that circumstantiality. So that's I think Garfinkel's original contribution here, and it's actually a contribution. You can go back all the way to the documentary method. Given the way that people think, they always think in dependence upon general patterns. These general patterns don't exist from the local details. In fact, they're based on the local details, but then people start defining the local details in terms of these general patterns or models. There's a history to it, to all this. And it's not that Garfinkel's advocating any ahistoricality, but we want to keep sight of the itinerary, if you don't want to use the word history, of the local situated reasoning and embodied actions that go into the production of these achieved coherences, of the coherent oriented details that the generalities are based on, or they gave rise to the generalities. So you don't want to put the generality ahead of the details. In fact, Garfinkel would argue, and it's kind of profound, the generality is those details. That is, there's no generality apart from those details. The generality that we want is generality in and as those details. It's not a textbook's generality. It's not a theoretical generality. It's a generality produced by the parties engaged in these laboratory inquiries. And it's part of the horizon of their research because the scientists are looking for generalities. So it's not that we can completely evade generalities. It's generalities that cause us to forget the circumstantial details that we want to avoid. So Garfinkel's claim is that his accomplishment in this little study is that he and his fellow researchers came upon the phenomenal field of Galileo's experiment. Maybe not the exact phenomenal field that Galileo had, because he didn't have cameras and stuff, but something like Galileo came upon. That is, that had a horizon of a temporal horizon of a future that it was a multi-dimensional temporality and not a leveled off temporality that they had. Things could fail, things could succeed, and what was going to happen next was still not certain. Okay? And so, I think it's a really important chapter, and I understand that people have a hard time with it. I mean, it's tough, everything about it, but it's rich. So we finished chapter 9, and fortunately for the time we have, at least there's no chapter 10. So I think that's good.